reading at Chapter 1 of Murder on the Flying Scotsman, and it is the first book in what is going to be a series. Chapter 1. And it's set in 1910, so just putting that out there. Lady Theodora Prescott-Pryce crossed the platform of King's Cross Station as the trains rolled in with puffs of steam and smoke. Her bags had already been loaded, but she didn't want to get on the train before she had to. She would be trapped for 9 hours from London with the same dull people through this, though her sacrifice was worth it to see her cousins in Scotland. Which you might have guessed from the title that she was heading to Scotland, because the Flying Scotsman is actually a real train, just so everybody knows, that goes from London to Scotland to Edinburgh, and it's actually still in operation today, run by, I want to say, Virgin Trains. Back to the book. Her nerves had very little to do with the journey itself. It was the people she'd be stuck with, all of them ready to interrogate her. She was a young, unmarried woman traveling with only her maid. The train was sure to be full of dowagers, wondering why she wasn't engaged or married. The masses swarmed towards their trains. They were making their final mad dash to board and find their seats before the train left without them. Most people were excited to take the train on a journey somewhere far away. Thea spared a glance back towards the clock. She had a few minutes before she needed to board. The hordes of people on the platform were overwhelming as she looked around, but she waited a little bit longer. Where was Molly? She was mostly surprised that her maid hadn't tried to rush to get her on. It was so unlike Molly to be running late. Despite being only 20, Molly Forbes had the oldest soul of anyone Thea had ever met. That included her grandmother, who didn't believe in electricity or telephones and was thoroughly offended that Thea's American mother did. At least this train wasn't taking her to Astormore to visit her brother. If that were the case, then she would have been obligated to visit her grandmother. She didn't dislike seeing her grandmother, but she always felt like she was a disappointment after visiting her. The Dowager Countess Prudentia Prescott-Pryce, alliteration there, tongue twister of a name, felt that all women should be married or engaged before the end of their first season, like she had been. That they should be mothers before they had passed 3 seasons. Thea didn't want to get married so young. To do so, she would give up her freedom. At 22, she was independently wealthy thanks to her American Aunt Dorothea. The season was just an endless parade of parties and balls. Once she married, she and her money would be put under her husband's thumb. It would put an end to her lifestyle as she knew it. A stern-faced woman in a navy blue suit dragged a girl only a few years older than Thea. Blonde-haired and blue-eyed, the girl would have no trouble finding a husband based on her looks, although her clothes were expensive but ill-fitting, as if they had been made for someone else. The girl's heel caught on one of the cracks in the platform, and she stumbled. Immediately, her mother turned to scold her. The girl looked to be on the verge of tears, but her mother didn't seem to care. Thea didn't envy the girl at all. She glanced back at the clock. Where was Molly? It was quite unlike her to disappear for so long. Her maid had claimed she was only going to the lavatory. Thea was going to head there to see what happened to her when she noticed a man in a tan coat staring at her. There was nothing particularly special about him, other than she felt as if he were watching her. He had a thoughtful expression on his face, like he had seen her somewhere before and was trying to place where he knew her from. He looked vaguely familiar, though she would puzzle over trying to place him. She was yanked from her thoughts by an older man ramming his trolley into her side. He apologized profusely, but Thea barely heard him. The man in the coat had vanished into thin air. Thea shivered and fiddled with her purse to occupy her hands. It was then, from the smoke, that Molly materialized beside her. "I beg your pardon, my lady. I didn't mean to be gone so long." Molly almost looked older than she was. She had her long brown hair tied back into a tight, proper, I can never pronounce this word correctly, chignon. Um, Basically, it's like a bun in the back of your hair, but it's kind of fancier than that for anybody who doesn't know. And it's actually a really pretty hairstyle, but that was how people wore it back then to try to hold up the hats. She wore a dark gray walking suit, one of Thea's cast-offs. It was an older style, but Molly wore it rather well. The boots were her own, just plain black, no frills. Thea studied her maid. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she kept looking over her shoulder, eyes darting nervously around the station. Something or someone had upset her. "Please, my lady, please, we need to get going," Molly begged, throwing an anxious look behind her in the direction of the clock. Thea nodded. The conductor was a short, portly man with an overwaxed mustache. Molly followed half a step behind, as if she was expecting to have to push Thea onto the train. Thea could barely keep from rolling her eyes at her maid. He took their tickets, smiling at both of them as they boarded the car which contained their compartment. Crowds made traveling difficult for her. Thea wasn't sure why, but being under the eyes of so many judgmental people always made her nervous. Traveling by train would not be so bad if it weren't for the forced interactions between other passengers at any time she left the compartment. She almost dreaded going to dine, since the restaurant car always seemed filled with the same busybodies. After 3 unsuccessful seasons, she would have thought she would have been used to it, but it felt like they were waiting for her to make a mistake. Passengers shuffled through the tight corridor. Once they reached her compartment, Thea collapsed onto the bench. She always loved being in the more public cars when she had traveled as a child. Now that she had grown and was an unmarried, mostly unchaperoned woman, the disapproving glares from the matrons had her cowering away in her compartment. She reached up and pulled the pin from her hat, sighing in relief as the heavy weight was removed from her head. Instantly, Molly rushed to take it from her hands. Thea opened the buttons on her jacket, and despite her corset, she felt as if she could actually breathe again. The trains whistled loudly, and the shrill noise pierced the air before the car jolted forward. The view outside the window shifted, and the train pulled from the station. The wheels clicked on the track. Steam surged up, obscuring her view. "Shall I get you some water, my lady?" Molly asked softly, offering a small smile. "No, thank you," Thea replied gratefully. She shrugged off her jacket, laying it on the seat beside her. Molly was ruffling through her travel bag. She pulled out Thea's worn copy of A Study in Scarlet and opened the bag. Thea smiled and shook her head as the maid buried her nose in the book. She wouldn't be surprised if the girl had brought as many books as she could fit into her satchel. Still, Thea found it funny how Molly disliked violence, but loved to read books about murder. Rather than read like Molly, she turned back to the window and watched as London began to pass by. Motor cars drove beside the horse-drawn carriages on the cramped London streets. People from all walks of life rushed to and fro. Soot-covered children in tattered rags ran down the cobbled streets. Women in their suffragette uniforms marched, their banners proudly displayed in protest. Stuffy businessmen watched the suffragettes with sneers on their faces. Or so she imagined, since she was too far to see them clearly. As the city moved outside her view, Thea's thoughts began to drift and fade away. She leaned her head against the wall beside the window. The world passed as the train rocked gently. The constant clacking of the wheels on the track made her eyelids grow heavy. So that's the end of chapter 1. I'm going to actually go into chapter 2. Chapter 2. The scraping of the compartment door pulled Thea from her fitful sleep. She thought she heard the door latch shut, and Molly's boots hit the floor. "Daniel!" Molly exclaimed. Thea's brow furrowed, but she forced herself not to open her eyes. To the best of her knowledge, Molly didn't know any men named Daniel. "What are you doing here? You can't be here. Not now. I need to see you. It's important." Daniel's voice was desperate. The rustle of clothing made Thea risk opening her eyes. Daniel was the man from the platform who had been wearing the trench coat. He swept Molly into his arms and kissed her soundly. Thea was sure she was dreaming. She had never seen two people kiss with so much passion, not outside her imagination. It was like watching Shakespeare performed it. It was so soft and gentle and all-consuming that she had to close her eyes because it felt as if her heart was being squeezed watching it. Molly was the one who pulled away, but Daniel kept stroking her cheek. It was like he needed to reassure himself that she was still there. His eyes were fixed on her, like he feared she would disappear if he looked away. Thea had a clear view of Daniel's face. He had been the man who had been watching her at the station. He was tall and handsome, with dark blonde hair and bright eyes. He had removed the outer coat and was wearing a well-tailored suit. "Why are you here, Daniel?" Molly asked softly. "Please, Molly, I need your help." His voice trembled as he spoke. Thea had never heard a man sound like that before, almost terrified. "You need to go." Thea squeezed her eyes shut as Molly started to turn around. "I need you to take this." There was a sound like paper crumpling in his hands as it rustled against the fabric of his jacket. Thea fought against the instinct to look. "Please go, Daniel, before she wakes up. I can't explain you being here. Just promise me you'll keep it safe for me until we reach Edinburgh. I'll explain everything there." Thea opened her eyes again. Daniel's hands were closed over Molly's as he pushed something, maybe an envelope, into her hands. She couldn't see Molly's expression from her angle, but she imagined the girl was eyeing him suspiciously. "What is it?" He shook his head. "Hopefully nothing important, but if anything happens to me, you'll need to give this to the police." "Is this gonna put me in danger?" He didn't answer for several minutes. "Daniel, are you in danger?" "I hope not, my love." He dipped his head to kiss Molly. The girl tilted her head up to meet his lips. He muttered something against her skin, burying his face in her neck. The whole sweet embrace was scandalous, and yet so very tender and sweet. There was something about the way she clung to him, almost unwilling to let him go, that lent an air of the tragedy to the whole affair. Then he pulled back and left her compartment as quickly as he could, without making too much noise. Molly started to turn around towards her, but Thea shut her eyes. She didn't know if she had just imagined the whole affair, or if it had really happened. I'm gonna get some water because I am dry. It is hot today. Make sure you're hydrating. An hour had to have passed before Thea woke up again. Feeling drowsier than she had before her nap, she blinked and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. Molly was curled up on the opposite side, her nose shoved into the book. Looking at her, Thea would have never known that anything happened while she had been asleep. It was still bright outside, brighter than it had been before her nap. It seemed like the sun had risen to mid-sky. Thea straightened up. Instantly, Molly sat up. "Is there anything I can get for you, my lady?" Thea shook her head as she stood and stretched. She caught a glimpse at the book Molly was so immersed in. She was still reading the same Sherlock Holmes novel. Molly was obsessed with a good mystery. "I'm all right." She glanced at her wristwatch. It was just after 1. She yawned a little, lifting her head to cover her mouth. "I think I'll go for lunch. Have you eaten?" "Yes, my lady. The trolley came around a little bit ago. I had a sandwich." Molly motioned to the cold, half-eaten sandwich that had been discarded on the seat. Thea grimaced. From the pallor of Molly's complexion, Thea doubted the food tasted good. "Would you care to join me in the restaurant car for a real meal?" She knew Molly would decline. Molly always declined, since she felt it was improper for her as a maid to dine with her employer in the restaurant car. But Thea's American mother had not raised her supremely as someone more British might have. and so she had no qualms about asking Molly to eat with her, despite already knowing her response. Molly shook her head. "No, thank you, my lady, unless you want to join me. Unless you want me to join you, my lady." Thea shook her head slightly as she smiled. "No, stay, enjoy your book." She waited a moment until her maid relaxed into the seat and lifted the book back up to begin reading again. Thea exited the compartment and headed in the direction of the dining car. As she walked, she noticed a man coming towards her from the dining car. At first, she did not register his face, not until he brushed against him, their shoulders bumping. He turned and moved to the side to let her pass. It was Daniel, Molly's lover, she realized. "Excuse me, miss," Daniel said softly. She swallowed. It hadn't all been a dream. Up until that point, she hadn't been completely convinced otherwise. He seemed to be pretending not to know who she was. Perhaps he didn't know her. She thought she imagined the whole thing, but a small flicker of recognition in his eyes told her otherwise. I just realized chapter 2 is really long because so much happens in this chapter. So I'm just going to keep reading for now, and I'll stop at the end of the chapter. The head waiter was standing in a small alcove just outside the main corridor of the restaurant car. He wore the same sort of uniform as the waiters at the most fashionable restaurants in London. The head waiter inclined his head respectfully. "Are you dining alone this afternoon, Lady Theodora?" She was a bit surprised that he knew her full name. She supposed that they had been told to learn each first-class passenger's name so that they could greet them personally when they came in. "Yes," she smiled at him. "Right this way, my lady." Thea nodded and followed him as he led her to a table for 4. She took the seat closest to the window. It felt more open, as if she hadn't escaped from the coming small talk. It was still early, so most of the car was empty. There were already a few seated, but no one she recognized from the society pages. People trickled into the car, slowly at first, but before the waiter could bring her something to drink, there were only a handful of empty seats left. Thea glanced at the unoccupied chairs at her table. If she truly wished to avoid interactions with the other passengers, she would have asked for one of the tables that only sat 2 people, and insisted Molly come along with her. The head waiter returned. He led a portly gentleman with a waistcoat that strained over his stomach. The man held himself stiffly, formally. If Thea was a betting woman, she'd say he was former military. The man's clothing was made from expensive materials, and his shoes were definitely not the shoes of an average middle-class man. He had graying hair. She'd say he was probably only a few years older than her father would have been, had he still been alive. The man bowed slightly. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Colonel Stephen Bantry. How do you do?" "Good afternoon, Colonel Bantry. I am Lady Theodora Prescott-Pryce." He pulled out a chair on the other side of the table by the aisle, facing the door. "I do hope you won't mind eating with an old bachelor like me, Lady Theodora." "Not at all, Colonel." "I'm afraid I'm not very good company." She laughed awkwardly. "That's fine with me." He rewarded her with a pleasant smile. "You wouldn't happen to be the same Stephen Bantry who is the author of Bravardi." The book had been one of her favorites. Her brother had given it to her one Christmas after her classmate's father brought it back from India. She had read the stories in it enough times to have them memorized, her copy tattered from years of enjoyment. In the book, he had translated and adapted the Hindu legends of the goddess Bravardi, whose love for Shiva had endured through her rebirth. The Colonel had served in British India for many years. In his autobiographical, I cannot say that word today. I don't know why, but you know what I mean. Work about his life in India. He explained how he had come from a well-to-do family and had followed a school friend into the army. Thea had made a quest of finding his books. They had been hard to come by in England. He grimaced. I'm afraid so. You've read it, then? I found it fascinating. She shifted slightly in her chair. Perhaps he would carry most of the conversation for her. What did one say when they met their favorite author? The next person to join them was a woman who looked to only be a few years older than Thea. Her blonde, bouncing ringlets strained from her hairdo, threatening to break free at any moment. Her vivid-colored wardrobe seemed to match her personality. Her rich purple shirt was paired with a fashionably cut blue silk shirt. There was a certain air to the woman, like she glowed from the inside. There was almost a foreign quality to her that Thea couldn't quite put a finger on. Mrs. Livingston, she introduced herself, smiling largely at the waiter. Thank you ever so much. The waiter bowed his head, clearly uncomfortable with being thanked for doing his job. He departed, and Mrs. Livingston's full attention came back to the table. How do you do? Her eyes shimmered as she offered a hand to Thea. Her accent was definitely not British. It was overdone, like an actor on the stage forcing her words to be said that way. She lowered herself into the seat next to Thea with the same overdramatic flair, every movement exaggerated. She batted her eyes at the colonel with the same excessive manner as her accent. The colonel introduced them both to Mrs. Livingston before he leaned forward. I couldn't help but notice your unusual accent. Where are you from, Mrs. Livingston? Please, do call me Wilhelmina. Mrs. Livingston is so stiff. She shuddered. I'm from Texas. My daddy is an oil man. When I was marrying age, my mama packed us on up and brought me over here. Thea was having a hard time believing anything out of her mouth. Her story seemed too rehearsed, just like her accent. It felt scripted, like Mrs. Livingston was just an actress, just like everything else about her. The colonel smiled and nodded, but otherwise didn't comment. He clearly didn't believe her either. It was strange to think of her as an American. Growing up, Thea had always thought of Americans as the quiet types, like her mother or uncle or cousins. Her aunt hadn't been as restrained as her siblings, but since she also raced automobiles, Thea never thought Dorothea to be like anyone else. She knew that they couldn't have been the case for the entire country, because a quiet country did not start a war over every little scene. It seemed like any time she received a letter from her American cousins, their country was off to fight something new, which is kind of ironic because the British also did the same thing. And they were actually at war around this time too, so her commentary is rather biased, which I found fun because she also thinks that the entire country all has that upper class mid-Atlantic accent that her mother would have had at this time, because she would have gone to like a special school for high-end upper class women, and I believe there was a couple in Connecticut. So she would kind of think of that sort of accent as being American, and this woman does not have an American accent, or that her version of an American accent, but she also does not have what is a Texas accent. She's just making up whatever. Perhaps her mother had learned to be more British. It seemed like the likely opinion. She certainly didn't act like the over-liberated Mrs. Livingston. Thea stayed silent as usual. She hardly felt the need to improve the silence with unnecessary small talk. Mrs. Livingston clearly disagreed with her. Well, aren't y'all just a talkative bunch, she said. Thea sighed and turned to the woman, picking the one topic that usually shut up the mouths of women so clearly looking for a lover outside their marriage. She had gathered a lot of experience in doing just that, usually when they would question why she was still unmarried. So will your husband be joining us for lunch? It seemed that Mrs. Livingston was the one person in the entire world that this was untested on, as the method quickly proved itself untrue. Mr. Livingston had some business to attend to, In London, still. Such a shame that he'll be missing out. He'll be traveling up in a few days. These big house parties are to die for." She smiled charmingly at the colonel, who acted as if he was oblivious to her, smiling and nodding just so. Mrs. Livingston deflated when she saw that he wasn't taking her bait to start a conversation. Thea supposed that it couldn't be any fun trying to have a one-sided conversation, but she made no effort to join the discussion. Besides, she highly doubted the other woman's dejected mood would last for long. The rest of the car was filling up. Thea wondered about the next person that the head waiter would bring over. Would they be reserved like the colonel, or loud and outspoken like Mrs. Livingston? She was hoping for someone more like the colonel. She didn't think she could survive lunch with two people like Mrs. Livingston, both working in tandem to drive her into insanity. Which I'm sure we all can feel that now, having been in social isolation for several weeks probably at this point. If you're stuck with somebody talkative or somebody who's really quiet and your two personalities are clashing, I'm sure you can understand where Thea is coming from at this point. The idea of being trapped with somebody so opposite. To Thea's pleasant surprise, the head waiter led a young man, younger than Colonel Bantry, but older than Mrs. Livingston, to the table. He was tall, with soft brown curls that looked like you could run your fingers through it. She wouldn't call him handsome, but she could see how he could be considered attractive. His eyes were probably the most engaging part of his face to her. They seemed like they were seeing everything. When he caught her staring, a small smirk crossed his face. The colonel stood, shaking the younger man's hand. "It has been some time." "Yes, it has. I hope you're well." "I am, thank you." The colonel waved to Thea and Mrs. Livingston. "May I present the Honorable Edward Thane? Thane, this is Lady Theodora Prescott-Pryce and Mrs. Wilhelmina Livingston." "A pleasure to meet you both," Mr. Thane greeted, inclining his head to them. Thea smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Thane." "How do you do, Mr. Thane?" Mrs. Livingston asked, her intentions obvious in her voice as she looked up at him through her angelically long lashes. Thea rolled her eyes and the colonel chuckled. It seemed as the newcomer had lifted the other woman's spirits again. Nothing seemed to be able to keep her down for long. She wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. "How do you do, Mrs. Livingston?" Mr. Thane took a seat next to the colonel, the only free one at the table. "Are you by chance related to Francis Livingston?" Mrs. Livingston's smile faded away. "He's my brother-in-law." He eyed her. "So you must be that American Francis' older brother Ernest married." "Yes," Mrs. Livingston said stiffly. "I'm sorry to have missed the wedding. I was unavailable that weekend." "That's quite all right." Wilhelmina forced a smile, but quieted. Mr. Thane smiled at the rest of them as the waiter brought over drinks in the first course. Thea felt a little warm inside as his gaze turned on her, and she had drunk a little too much champagne a little too fast. Unable to look at him any longer, Thea dropped her gaze into her hands. She focused on her gloves, folding them neatly into her purse. They were her favorite pair of white gloves. "So what brings y'all on up to Scotland?" Mrs. Livingston had presented the question to the table, but it was spoken directly to Mr. Thane. Like the colonel, the younger man appeared to be oblivious or immune to her charms, preferring to watch the rest of the car rather than their table. Thea bit her tongue. She wished Molly was eating with her. It was a shame, since Molly made for very good company. Most of the time, her maid seemed far better suited for high society than Thea. Thea had often wondered if she could get away with switching places with the maid to rid herself of social obligations. Perhaps life would have been easier if she was outgoing like Mrs. Livingston. She seemed to make friends easily. The woman certainly didn't care what people thought about her. She was larger than life. Mrs. Livingston made Thea's small acts of childhood rebellion look mild. She wondered what it would feel like, if it would be freeing. She hated the trivialness of the socially acceptable meal topics, or worse yet, that they even had to converse over their food at all. Somehow talking through her meals always seemed like a way to take her appetite. It appeared that this was not the case for Mrs. Livingston. And I think I will cut off there because there's still a whole lot in this chapter to go, and there's 20 minutes left, so I'll do questions if anybody has any. While I wait for the questions to come in, I will tell you a little bit more about the book. So, I got this whole idea for this when I heard about Nanowrimo, which is National Write a Novel in a Month, and I went, I really want to do that. That's always been something on my list, and at the moment I wasn't working, which the minute I committed to doing this, because most of my work is freelance, I had tons of jobs at that point, which then I wound up writing a lot of this on my phone, and it just did not connect well, and things, so it took me like 2.5 years to revise this after I wrote the first draft, because there was just so much trying to fix and match up what I had written. So I chose 1910 because it was a really interesting time period. It was before that whole Downton Abbey era that we kind of think of as Edwardian and all, but it was still technically Edwardian, and it was before the war, but it was a very modern. There was electricity and telephones and telegraphs, and there wasn't radio yet, but it was getting close to being there. And women were not yet liberated, but they were getting close, because as she mentioned in there, there was suffragettes walking around and marching. And I always have enjoyed that time period. I always loved the clothes. They were really, there was a lot going on right in that time, and a lot was happening in England at that time. 2 years before was the Franco-British exhibition and the Olympics, so they were still probably coming down from some of that, not all of that, because it was 2 years before. But that celebrated a treaty that Britain had just started with France, which the treaty became famous around the time of World War I because that was the basis of the Allies' agreement. So I've always loved that time period and always wanted to write something in there. And when Nano came around, I said, hey, I've got these characters that I've created, and let me just come up with a story idea. I know I want to do a murder mystery, and I've always loved trains, and so it kind of just fell together with that. But I went into it with next to no plot and just characters and kind of who's who, and that is not a great way to write things. It might work for some people, but it didn't work well for me, because then I had to do a lot of revising to try to create a story. Carrie, what was the most fun part of the process for you? The most fun was going and actually being a part of the whole Nano thing, because that's how I met Megan and met everybody else. But so trying to the whole process was like a learning experience, so I enjoyed all of that. From Writer's Atelier, how did I get into writing mysteries? Kind of fell into that. My mother reads a lot of cozy mysteries, and she was like, hey, you might enjoy this. Come on over and come read this stuff. And so I started reading all that, and I'm like, I like it, but a lot of it's contemporary, and the contemporary is just not really my thing unless it's contemporary fantasy, which is. But so I said, oh, how about historical? And that's a whole genre of itself. And but I've always been interested in mysteries. I wrote the first mystery story when I was in 5th grade, actually. It was called The Code Club, if I remember correctly, and it was all about codes and crossword puzzles, and it was like a birthday surprise for that they were trying to solve these codes so that they could get the present. And it was a picture book, and it was for a contest in school, which I won first place in, and someday we'll fix it up and fix the illustrations and actually publish that. So, Megan, favorite thing to research? I really loved researching the train itself. I mean, I would say clothing, but I'm really... The train was fun to research because I got to learn all these weird things. Like the Flying Scotsman, I said, has been around for about 150 years, which is really cool because most things do not last that long. But the train started to, at 10.5 hours for how long it would take to get in the 1860s from London to Scotland, which was not as long as had been, but it was cut down on time and eventually became about 8 hours, which would have been around when Thea was on it. And so it was neat to see how all these things happened along the way. And that researching that was how I found out like about the wireless telegram and all. I didn't know when that had come in, but trying to find was it was very interesting, and I got to learn a lot with it. Megan tells me wants to know how I drew Thea. Well, the first version, this version, was actually just a notebook paper sketch that I pulled onto the computer and tried to fix it up in Photoshop, and as you can see, she's very rigid. She's not very friendly looking. So then for this version, I took several pictures as reference from different clothing and fashion plates from that time period, and I tried to give her a slimmer silhouette so that she matched more of what that 1910 look was. Also, she's got that large hat, which hats reached their peak of largeness around 1912, but up until that point they were pretty wide. So they wound up having huge hairstyles and these super long hairpins, and at the longest the hairpins were about 12 inches, and they were actually used to attack people with, which comes into play. And actually they became banned at one point because they were, the certain length became banned. I think it was over 8 inches because women were using them for self-defense. Thank you, Carrie. I'm glad you liked the cover. I did plan on changing between books. I was going to change up the color scheme. The next one I was thinking more gray and blues, but I might go more purple. I'm not sure. But I actually had a different silhouette that I had drawn before this one that I wanted to use for book 2. Book 2 is mostly plotted and drafted out. I haven't looked at it since November, but that's but I have a rough idea of what I kind of want the cover for that one to look like, but I'm going to keep this similar format with the title, and I like having the title of the series so that people know where it is, what series it's in, and I like having the number for the book. On the ebook, I actually put it right here because obviously you don't have a spine on ebooks, and it makes it hard to... that's something I've always had a problem with ebooks, when people don't number which book it is in the series on the front cover, because then I'm looking at them and I'm going, wait, is this one book 1, is this one book 2, and then I have to go look on Goodreads and try to figure out, and by that point I normally have gone off the book. Did I ever think of doing the voices accents? Yes and no, mostly because I cannot fake a British accent at all. I've actually known several British people that have told, and Australian and all that sort of accent group that have told me I cannot and should not try it because I am bad. But about the only other accent I can do deliberately is Southern, like really Southern, because I grew up in the southern, a very southern town in Florida that the accents were very thick in, so it was great. It was not... It took me a while to lose that. And it'll still come through in my voice when I get stressed, and I think I started to pick up some of it when I did some of Wilhelmina's voice. Yeah. Plans for future books. Yes. Yeah, I have book 2. Right now I have about 8 plotted. Not full plotted, but I have like title ideas and story ideas. I might go less than that, but definitely want to have a completely have a complete series. And from what I've plotted, it's going to take place in about the span of a year. So this actually takes place in late August, early September of 1910. And I want to say what I have for the last one is June or July of 1911. So it takes place pretty quick, and yeah, so burgundy rose would be great too. Yes, I do have pink for one. One of them that I want to do is a book on fashion and all, because that ties into this and ties into Molly and Daniel's story. And so I really want to bring that in, because I didn't really have Molly in book 2, what I've drafted so far, which I won't tell you too much about because I don't want to give it away. But her story and Thea's cousin and all will intersect. Thea's going to visit her 2 cousins, a brother and a sister, and her aunt and uncle who live in Scotland. They're, I want to say, an earl and his wife, and they live in a castle. So book 2 is going to be set in a castle because it takes place sort of directly after this one, and that was a lot of fun to research because castles. Yeah, so it will, book 3 or 4, as I want to say, the one about fashion, and it's going to cover a lot of that getting ready into the, or might be later on, getting ready for the season and the winter season, the London season. I'll cover that. Is a big, very big thing in London at this time. If you've read any historical set earlier on. You'll kind of know about it if you've watched Downton Abbey. They cover it with Lady Rose and with Sybil. And I really loved all of that because it was a big thing about showing off in the clothes and even though they were husband hunting at that point and trying to find good marriages so that they could increase their standing, they really were showing off for each other because they would go, oh, look at this dress, it's very expensive, look how much money I have, and most of them did not have the money to support these dresses and this fashion. I want to say it was something like $300 for one dress, one evening dress, so that was a crazy thing, and I love to research all of that, so I'm looking forward to writing that one. Carrie, I had to try hard to lose my Boston accent. Well, I don't hear it most of the time with you, so I don't think I've actually ever heard it with you. So, but yeah, yeah. Angelique, book numbers on the cover make it, yes, it does make it easier. And yeah, that was always big frustration as a reader for me, is when things need to be read in order and you're reading it and you're like, wait a second, I'm at book 2? What happened here? What happened to book 1? That actually happened to me years ago, and I read book 2 first on a series, and then I read book 1 after, and didn't realize, but I was very confused at stuff in book 2, and I kept going back and trying to figure out what happened and why things had happened, and then I looked up and I'm like, really? I gotta go out and find book 1, because book 1 was not easily available on the shelves at that point, and it was really kind of interesting experience. So I knew right away before I wrote a book that I would want to put them on the front or on the spine somewhere to make it easy for people to know that, hey, here's book 1, here's book 2, book 3, etc. So we have about 1 minute left. It's 3:59. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Carrie's accent is a joy to hear. I'm gonna have to take your word on that because I don't think I've ever heard her with the accent. I would love to hear it though. Thank you, Bethany. It's great to see you on here. I'm glad to see you and hope everything's been going well with you guys. And yeah, so it's 4 o'clock. Thank you for sticking with me through all of this and my adventure trying to figure out live stream. I actually had to download Chrome to get it to work because it wouldn't work on Safari, so that was interesting. And I'm sure Megan will laugh at that because I know she's a dedicated Chrome person. But yeah, thank you everybody, and make sure you check out my giveaway on my page and subscribe to my newsletter if you liked it and want to hear more. And check out Writers Atelier, who put this whole thing on. Thank you, and hope everybody stays well, and if you're in Florida, I hope you stay cool because it's hot. And good night. Thanks for watching.